Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith, Photog J the Great. Last time we left off, I was talking about Aperture, and we had just gotten up to the point of shutter speed, and I was going to go into some more details about that. So that's where we're going to pick up today. As you know, kind of recapping from last time, Aperture is basically the opening of the lens. So if you have a smaller f number like f1.8 or f2 or f2.8, you're basically letting more light into your lens, and that smaller f number also means that you have less depth of field, meaning that you have less of the background in focus. If you pick a larger f number, like say f11 or f16, you basically let in less light into the camera and you have more depth of field, so you have more in focus in the background. On shutter speed is just a little bit different. Basically, whenever light's entering the camera, the first thing that's going to happen is light's going to be affected by the aperture, your lens opening. The next thing, though, is going to be your shutter speed, and that's basically how long the camera shutter stays open between, between shots. So basically, if you have a longer shutter speed, you're going to let in more light into the camera. If you have a shorter shutter speed, you're going to let in less light. If you have a quicker shutter speed, I should say. Basically, just like Aperture though, Aperture of course controls how much light's coming in, but it also controls depth of field. Your shutter speed also, once again, controls how much light's coming in, but it also controls how moving subjects are going to be rendered in your pictures. So if I am shooting sports, and I'm shooting, let's just say I'm shooting basketball. In a scenario like that, with any type of fast moving action, I want to have a faster shutter speed. So I'd want to have something like, I'd want to start at probably about 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second. And that would allow me to freeze the action better. If I were shooting at, let's say I was shooting a waterfall, and I wanted all the water to just appear like just a nice mist, nice, kind of foggy kind of look. Or if I were shooting a photo of some cars at night, and I wanted to get all the lights of the cars, just an endless stream of light trails, then that's another scenario where I would use a longer shutter speed. I would leave the shutter open longer. So I may use like an 1/8 of a second. I may use a 1/2 second. I may even use full seconds. Like in one of the examples I'm going to show you, I actually took a photo at, I believe it was about 22 seconds or somewhere in that neighborhood. So that's basically what that's going to do. But anyways, enough about that part of it. Let's go ahead and look closer at the camera, and I'll show you how this works. Using my D700 as an example here again, we can take a look at shutter speed here a little bit closer. For the sake of demonstration, I am shooting in full manual on this one. We'll get to the other mode, which is shutter priority, in just a moment. Okay, but if we were shooting in full manual here, and for the time being, we're actually going to disregard the ISO, because guess what? That's going to be the next video. So for the time being, we're just going to look at the shutter speed. Now, I'm not going to go back over this too much, because I did make a video kind of on camera controls, and I'll probably be doing some more of that later on. So on your camera, it's going to be a little bit different, but on this particular camera, there are two different command dials. There's one on the front for aperture, there's one on the back for shutter speed. So if we take a look at this, you can see that I can adjust shutter speed just like that. Now, this is kind of where we can tie in or tie together some of our elements. If we were shooting something, and ordinarily you would typically adjust aperture first, unless of course you were shooting something that's moving. If you were taking photos, sports or something like that, and you need that faster shutter speed, let's just assume that you needed a shutter speed of, well, typically for sports, I'd start at about 1/250th of a second and go up from there. So we're going to start there. So if we were at 1/250th of a second, under the lighting conditions in this room right now, notice this right here. this is our meter, and that's telling us that, of course, it's all the way over there at the minus. That's telling us that it's going to be that the photo is going to be way too dark if we take a photo under these conditions. If we were to go to a slower shutter speed, see, we can actually get to the exposure we need. But we don't want to shoot at a fifth of a second. That's going to be way too slow. Well, A, it's going to be way too slow for us to hold, and B, it's not going to come anywhere near freezing action. So if we were shooting here, our f-stop is at 6.3. Now if I open up the aperture a bit, see, it basically works like a seesaw. If I have one setting here, with this at a 60th of a second, if I go to a faster shutter speed here, I have to open up a lens to offset that. So whenever I was up here, at an f-stop of 6.3, I could go all the way down. I had to go all the way down to get the shutter speed that was the right exposure. If I say, okay, I can't do that, I need faster shutter speed, then notice I have to open up the f-stop, go down to a lower aperture to let in more light to get there. And now at 1.4, see, we are getting much closer. Now, this is why photographers use lenses that go to a very, very low f number, especially for sports. Because if you're shooting in a situation where you know that you have to have a faster shutter speed to freeze action, well, that means that less light has time to come into the camera to make the proper exposure. So the only way to offset that is to open up the lens. And then there's this other magical thing called ISO that you could kind of view as a mediator between f-stop and shutter speed. It helps you get a little bit closer. But we'll get there in the next video. One other thing I want to point out to you about shutter speed, that's kind of talking about it in a kind of a sports type scenario. Just for general shooting, like if you're taking portraits or something like that, if you're shooting something that's not moving very fast, obviously if you're a landscape photographer and you say, okay, I want to have a lot of depth of field, I want to have a lot in focus in this scene, and you go to say f11, it really doesn't matter how low your shutter speed ends up, to be honest with you. If you're just shooting a landscape and there's nothing moving in the scene, as long as your camera's on a tripod, then you have absolutely no worries there. But for most general shooting, like shooting portraits and things, someone in the comments asked me once if I use a tripod for shooting portraits, and the truth is I don't. I think in one of my lens reviews I said that I hated tripods, and someone was like, oh well, I'm not listening to anything you're saying ever again, Jeremy. I'm sorry you feel that way, but yeah, I'm not a fan of tripods, but we'll get to that later on in another video. For general shooting though, provided that you're dealing with a subject that's relatively still, just a normal portrait situation, usually I don't ever like to go below a 60th of a second anytime I'm shooting. Even if it is a portrait situation, just a quick move of the subject can still end up with some motion blur caused by them moving. The other thing though that you want to keep in mind though is something called the Reciprocal Rule. Basically that's a quick and dirty way of being able to tell how slow of a shutter speed you can go to without any shake from your hands affecting the image quality. So basically, it's pretty simple actually. Say for example you have a 50mm lens on your camera. If you have a 50mm lens on your camera, technically the lowest that they recommend you shoot would be a 50th of a second. If you had a 24mm lens on your camera, the lowest you could shoot would be, well, 1/24th of a second. There is no 1/24th of a second on your camera, so you want to go to the closest thing that's still higher. So, well, it wouldn't be a 20th, well, it would be a 25th. If you were shooting with a 200mm lens on your camera, then you'd want to go to 1/200th of a second. So that kind of gives you an idea there. Basically, the longer the lens you're shooting with, the faster the shutter speed you need to have. And generally speaking, even though if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, you can usually go down to a very low shutter speed, generally speaking, as a general rule, it's best not to go below a 60th of a second without a tripod, regardless of what lens you're using. And this is going to be affected a little bit by some other things, like vibration reduction lenses, or as Canon calls it, image stabilization. That's going to affect things a little bit also, but that's once again something for another video. This kind of sums up everything for now on shutter speed. Oh, actually, let me show one last thing here, I guess. You've of course got your shutter priority mode here. So that's the S mode on your camera. And on this one, it's kind of like the aperture priority mode that I showed you guys last time, except it works in the reverse. In aperture priority mode, you set the f-stop and the camera determines the shutter speed. In this mode, you set the shutter speed and then the camera sets the f-stop. So you can see here, if I go to a slower shutter speed, the camera starts to close down. If I start to go to a faster shutter speed, the camera is eventually going to get to the point where, see how it keeps opening this lens up? Eventually it opens up this lens all the way to 1.4, which is as wide as it goes. And on Nikon it starts to say low right there. And that's basically saying, hey you dummy photographer, you can't shoot at this shutter speed with this lens under these conditions because I can't open up this lens anymore to actually get the right exposure. So if we were to take a photo under these settings, we'd end up with a black picture. So that's basically what that's saying. And if you run into this situation where you need that fast shutter speed and you have your lens as wide as it can go, then there's one more thing you can do after that, but that is what you guys will have to come back for next time. Until then, this is Jeremy Smith, Photog J the Great, signing off.